Welcome to Asian Insider, a podcast series by the Straits Times. I'm your host, Nirmal Ghosh. Today, we look at prospects of and expectations from the US ASEAN relationship. A summit that was supposed to have taken place some weeks ago did not materialize because of scheduling issues, and now is on the calendar again. It will be hosted by the US and it will be at the White House. Now, as of this moment, we don't have any official confirmed date. It may well be out as we speak. But regardless, what is the state of the US ASEAN relationship? And more importantly, what are the expectations? Joining me today are Elina Noor, who is Director, Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director at the Washington, D.C. office of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Hi, Elina. Thank you for making your time today.
Thanks for
Appreciate it.
having me, Nirmal.
And Bich, a non-resident adjunct fellow at the Southeast Asia program of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, also here in DC. So good to have you both an Asian Insider. Thank you, Bich, as well. Thank you for making time.
Thanks, Nirmal.
So, Elina, if I may start with you, the US has repeatedly affirmed the centrality of ASEAN. On March 29, when Singapore's Prime Minister met President Joe Biden at the White House, the two, in a joint statement, said they, quote, reaffirmed their strong support for ASEAN centrality and the ASEAN-centered regional architecture. Elena, could you unpack that? What are Washington's expectations of this sometimes dysfunctional group of Southeast Asian states? And what are ASEAN's expectations? Lengthy question, but it would be great to hear your take.
Lengthy and huge question. I'm going to try to make sense of it. If only we could get inside the head of policymakers, right? So let me start with this notion of ASEAN centrality that you raised, Nirmal. So we've seen, I think, an almost repetitive but very welcome mantra from Washington of support for ASEAN centrality. And you've seen this in the Indo-Pacific strategy. You've seen this even in the statements that have come out of Quad summits, as well as the Aukus announcement. It's unclear exactly what Washington means by this, and it may well be that what Washington means may not be shared by every single capital in Southeast Asia. But what we've seen from the documents is that it means a stronger and empowered ASEAN in order to deliver sustainable solutions for ASEAN-related matters, for example. And I think we've seen a semblance of this with the United States and other countries, including multilateral organizations like the United Nations, kind of give leadership to ASEAN to manage the Myanmar crisis. And so I think you've seen that as a concrete example in a way. But practically what it means, we're not quite sure, because ASEAN has so far not managed to move the needle on the Myanmar crisis. It hasn't so far been able to come up with a united front on a position with regards to the Ukraine-Russia crisis. And certainly there's no expectation for ASEAN to have such a united position. But I think what also is in the minds of many of us who question this notion of ASEAN centrality is whether Washington really means what it says, right? So, for example, Washington talks a lot about having ASEAN unity and centrality, but at the same time, Washington, deliberately or not, seems to be preferring certain Southeast Asian countries over others. And I think from the ASEAN perspective, Southeast Asian states would like to see Washington be more engaged in the region, but in an inclusive way. And an example is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, because a lot of complaints coming out of Southeast Asia is that Washington really hasn't been involved economically compared to, say, other partners like China, even Japan and the European Union, for example. Now, in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the details are still very scant, of course, but it seems right now that it doesn't seem to be an inclusive framework for all 10 ASEAN member states. And so on the one hand, you have this rhetoric about support for ASEAN centrality, but on the other hand, there's also this dissonance about how Washington treats Southeast Asian states as a collective within the ASEAN grouping.
Interesting. Beck, if I may get you for a moment and drill down specifically on Vietnam, which is such a unique and fascinating case, a state on China's border which understands China very well, with its own sphere of influence in the Mekong sub-region, yet with a close relationship with the US, which, however, did not prevent it from abstention in the UN votes against Russia because of its traditional relationship with Russia, and that includes buying arms from Russia, just as India does, for example. Tell me, what does Vietnam specifically expect from the US, and what does it want and what doesn't it want?
Yeah, so Vietnam. So first, it would like to continue to get support for its stand in the South China Sea. Maybe not explicitly support Vietnam position, but more like criticizing China actions in the South China Sea. And the United States has been doing so in the last few years. So Vietnam would like to continue to see that. And the second element is that Elina already mentioned is about more engagement in the economics field. So that I think that the two main things that Vietnam expects from the United States at the moment.
What does it not expect? Does it? There's been criticism of Vietnam on human rights, for example.
Yeah, so Vietnam has the the suspicion that U.S. support for uh, for Vietnamese descendants and also promotion of higher human rights standards is aiming at overthrowing the Vietnamese Communist Party. So in terms of that, Vietnam is quite sensitive in this issue.
And you mentioned the South China Sea, so let me stay with you for a moment there, but switch to the Philippines. And Elena, I'm going to get to you as well on the Philippines. So the Philippines is holding an election next month, and it looks like there is a strong chance Bongbong Marcos will come to power. Now, if that happens, uh, Big, do you expect any shift in policy vis-a-vis China?
So I think that it most likely stay the same because in some remarks is yeah, he said that China you know yeah, he said that Duterte was dealing with China in the right way. So I think that there would be a great continuity in his policy toward China.
Elena, agree on that?
Yeah, I mean, I learned from Filipino analysts that Bongbong Marcos is the only one who does not have a platform on the South China Sea, does not have a foreign policy platform. And we haven't heard this very directly from him. It appears that he is flexible on his positioning with regards to the South China Sea and engagement with China. So I think the jury's still out. And until we get a specific decision on who it is who will be occupying the presidency in Malacanang, I think, will leave that question open.
Okay, Elena, Malaysia and Indonesia have expressed concern about Aukus, the Australia UK US security tech arrangement, which will eventually see Australia fielding nuclear powered submarines. How does Aukus sit with these two countries and with ASEAN as a whole?
Yeah, as you said, Nirmal, I think there's been more caution that have been expressed by both Jakarta and Putrajaya with regards to AUKUS. And part of the reasoning is that AUKUS is very defense forward in its orientation compared to, say, the Quad, which seems to have a more benign agenda with its climate change and public health focus, amongst others. And so the worry in both countries, in Malaysia and Indonesia, is that the AUKUS arrangement will actually destabilize security in Southeast Asia. And I think if you look closely as well at some of the other statements that have come out from other countries in Southeast Asia, Singapore and Vietnam included, if you look at the statements that have come out, and Vic, you can correct me if I'm wrong, those statements have also been on kind of the wariness trajectory. It's been more of a, well, we'll see if this turns out to be constructive or not. But until now, we'll reserve judgment. Whereas with Indonesia and Malaysia, I think both countries have come up quite explicitly about their anxiety that it will undermine the security and peace in the region, especially if not managed correctly.
Beck, has the stock of the United States in ASEAN increased with Joe Biden in power here? Is there any sense to that effect? What is the view of the current US administration in ASEAN? We're just over a year into this new administration. Not new anymore, but yeah. So just curious as to what the ASEAN view is.
Also, before I answer your question, can I come back to what Elina said about Vietnam's statement?
Absolutely.
So, Vietnam has a policy of not naming anyone. So, in every statement, either it's FONOPS or Aukus, it doesn't name any countries in there. It's always tried to stay very neutral. So, some people say that Vietnam is very welcoming the developments, but Elina has a different view. Uh, but for me, I think Vietnam is, I think from me, I think Vietnam is trying to be very cautious because it's aware that some of its neighbors may be wary about the development. So it's very difficult to say what Hanoi is really thinking just by the statements. And regarding your question about the Biden administration, how it's viewed in Southeast Asia, I think that certainly there's like a lot more positive view on the Biden administration compared to the Trump administrations. But it doesn't prevent Southeast Asian capitals to worry about the future, the next administration in the United States.
Elena, any parting shot, maybe on the same theme?
I mean, I agree with Big. There's definitely more of a welcoming stance of the Biden administration in Southeast Asia than there was a few years ago. And on from Washington as well, I think there's really a concerted effort and a determination, or at least an intention, to reach out more, to be present in the region as the region has asked of it. The I think what we're still waiting to see is whether Washington can deliver. So, Nirmal, you started off with saying that there was supposed to have been a summit. There isn't a summit just yet. Perhaps that's imminent in a month or so. We also are waiting for this Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and what it will eventually bring about. Because right now there are no market access possibilities, which is what Southeast Asia wants. That said, I think despite all these perhaps delays in actual engagement, operationalization of that engagement, the fact that Washington has made the effort to show up, to reach out, to try to set something up, is still viewed very positively in the region.
Okay, Elena, Noor, Big Chan, such a pleasure hearing from the two of you today. So glad you could come on the show, find the time for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nirmal.
That nicely wraps that nicely wraps this discussion up for the Asian Insider podcast. I'm your host, Nirmal Ghosh. Join me and my expert guests for the next episode on the fourth Friday of every month.